Welcome to the Doctors Making a Difference podcast, where we help physicians to be empowered with the tools they need to be successful in medicine, in finance, and in life. Join us as we highlight doctors and other professionals around the world who are making a difference. Today's episode is unique. We're going to talk with Barbara VanHare. She runs an organization, a nonprofit called Pattern.org. Pattern.org, part of the Rare Cancer Research Foundation. And they have this unique role of trying to be at the very center of collecting information and trying to collect tissue samples so that we overcome institutional barriers and make sure that hopefully thousands of patients with rare tumors across a variety of different types of cancer can collect information into a central repository that researchers worldwide can access. I do think this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a ton of information that can be collected from this. And instead of having rare cancer rely on just a very small subset of patients, you can get to the place where we try to collect information for the very large majority of these cancers. And I think this is an exciting time to be in this world. You never want to have cancer. You never want to be the person who has that diagnosis. But if you must have it, I'm thankful for those who are doing research and trying to find answers. And I really appreciate Barbara taking the time to do this. So stay tuned. I'm pleased to welcome our wonderful friend, I want to say doctor, but she talks like a doctor, but Barbara VanHare is a wonderful person who heads an organization called Pattern, and she works for Rare Cancer Research Foundation. I think you're going to really enjoy this, and I want to introduce Barbara. Barbara, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Sure. As Peter said, I'm Barbara VanHare, and I'm with the Rare Cancer Research Foundation. And I am president of Pattern.org, which is an initiative of the Rare Cancer Research Foundation that we'll be talking about here today.
That's wonderful. So we're going to talk a lot about this. This episode, as my longtime listeners know, I have a recurring series called Living with Metastatic Cancer. And we focus a lot on doctor stories, and doctors making a difference. And we also talk about some of the things that are available and useful for physicians and for patients who are dealing with rare cancers like solitary fibrous tumor. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But before we get into the specifics, I want to hear a little bit about your story. How did you come to work for Rare Cancer Research Foundation? And specifically, how did you learn about solitary fibrous tumor and some of these rare cancers that you are working with?
That's a great question. And my path was a little different probably than most getting into the rare cancer space. After spending 30 years at Hallmark Cards, primarily in sales and marketing, there had been a long history in my family of rare cancers. My dad was diagnosed in 1959 with a rare oral cancer. My brother, my only sibling, was diagnosed in 2009 with glioblastoma multiforme, the deadliest brain cancer there is. The good news is he is still living, which is a miracle. His eldest son was diagnosed with ocular melanoma at age 28 in 2012. And that, my nephew, Mark, is the one that started the Rare Cancer Research Foundation. And the reason why he started it is as he approached treatment for his disease, he found that literally nothing had changed in the previous 25 years for his rare cancer. And he set about trying to figure out why that was. And during that journey, he learned that it wasn't just atypical for his cancer, that not much progress had been made, but it was typical across rare cancers, that basically there wasn't the infrastructure in place to allow researchers to get access to what they need to find new discoveries, to help find new therapies. So he created the Rare Cancer Research Foundation in late 2013 to do that, to help patients and advocacy groups and researchers across the U.S. and actually across the world in terms of research to help make the research go faster by getting those researchers what they need. So in 2014, I joined the organization. Initially, my position was to reach out to patients and patient communities to tell them about the work we do. And fast forward 12 years later, and I am president of Pattern.org, which is a key initiative to help bring patients and researchers closer together.
Thank you so much for that synopsis. I think it's important to state the problem, just like you said, all cancer needs attention. But there are so many different subtypes of cancer. And really, when you look at the subtypes of cancer. It's almost like everybody has a rare cancer because there's so many different genetic variabilities. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize how unique and rare each cancer is. It is so important to be able to connect all those pieces and overcome some of the regulatory barriers to make it so people can't get tissue samples or do proper research. And it's going to be so frustrating when you say, look, we pushed the timeline forward 15, 20 years and very little progress made on some of these rare cancers. So you saw a problem, your nephew saw a problem and started an organization so we could try to overcome some of this. So trying to eliminate some of those barriers and move the field forward is a really noble and really cool initiative. So thank you for what you're doing.
Great. It's very motivating to work with patients and advocacy groups as well as researchers to try to bridge the gaps that are there. As you mentioned, really all cancers at some point probably will be classified as a rare cancer because the more we learn about each cancer and how it reacts differently in different individuals. But our primary focus right now is what people consider to be the rare cancers, the pediatric cancers, the sarcomas, solitary fibrous tumor being one of those, appendix cancer, all the different ones that maybe people have never even heard of. And the key is, as we say, these cancers are rare. So that means by definition, there aren't that many patients with them. And when you have a small patient group and it's spread out across the country, any given institution, even the largest academic centers, may not see enough patients in 1 year to be able to get the clinical data and the tissue that they need to be able to study those cancers. So we work across the board with patients and with institutions to try to bring those two groups together. So we've mentioned pattern.org, and what that does is it allows any patient, regardless of where they're being treated in the US, whether it's a small community hospital or a large academic center, if a patient wants to contribute their excess tissue, so tissue that's not needed for their individual care, and or clinical data, their medical history, they can go on to pattern.org, consent to give us access to that tissue or that data, and then we'll take it from there, de-identify the tissue and or data, and put it either in a biorepository so that researchers have access to that tissue, or send it directly to researchers that are utilizing that tissue today, and de-identify that data and share that so that the researchers and bioinformaticians can find what's called patterns in the tissue or data. Hence the name pattern.org.
Perfect.
Is because really what research are looking for are patterns that help them make discoveries to lead to new treatment options.
So walk me through it for just a second. So I have shared with my listeners that I have solitary fibrous tumor. So if I end up having another biopsy and I say my treatment institution needs that sample initially so they could do the testing that needs my care, but now they have a little bit of extra, how do I go about getting that information to pattern both the specific tissue sample and the information associated with it? What are the steps? Like how would a person with a rare tumor go about doing that?
So if you have a rare tumor and you're having a procedure, whether that be a biopsy or a surgery or even a fluid drain, for some cancers, fluid will build up in the abdomen or around the lungs. The patient can go on to pattern.org, put in some basic information about themselves, like their name, what type of diagnosis they have. And then on pattern.org, after they put in that information, they'll be matched to a study or to our biobank. If we don't currently have a study in need of that tissue, or if there's a study that needs a certain amount of tissue samples before they can start, we'll temporarily store them in our biobank. And so the patient will go through the process online on pattern.org. There's a consent that they can go through page by page, take their time reading through it, and then they can actually consent online. After they consent, we'll get a little more information about where their procedure is going to occur. And even if they don't have a procedure coming up and they just want to share their medical information, that's great too. They go through the same process. Once they finish that consent, we're immediately notified, and then we'll start to work on what we call their case. So if they are having a procedure like a biopsy or a surgery, then we'll reach out to their clinicians at that particular hospital. It can vary by patient and by hospital in terms of who we talk to, but usually it will involve potentially a surgeon, an interventional radiologist, the pathologist. There can be lots of people depending on the situation. We'll tell them who we are, that the patient has consented. We can send them a copy of the consent and our protocol that of how this work is overseen by our regulatory body. And then we will send in, if they are interested in donating tissue or fluid, then we will send overnight a kit with all the components that they need. We try to make it really easy for the clinicians there to just put in the tissue into the kit. We may also ask for some blood if blood is being collected. And then they seal up the kit. It's got a prepaid address sticker that goes on the box after they seal it up. We even include the tape in the box. And then it goes off to either the research center that's going to study that tissue immediately, or it goes to temporary storage in our biobank. And then we'll notify researchers about the ability to access that tissue for the studies where they're working on these various rare cancers.
So it sounds like you've addressed both sides of it. I'm a busy physician, and if a patient comes to me and says, I want to do this big, long, extra thing, and I'd like you to spend several extra hours researching this on my behalf, sometimes we don't have the capacity to do it, like to ask the staff. We'll try to accommodate what the person needs, but that is useful from the clinician side to say, there's just a box, here it is, here's the mail, and you even have the tape in the box. So
Right.
you have that part is easy. And then the second is that the patient can sign their forms online, and the kit is sent to their institution, to their clinicians, so that they can get it. And so it sounds like that part's relatively easy to send the tissue sample to get into pattern. Is that correct?
That is correct. We've tried to make it as easy as we can, to the point that our kits even have a self-cooling technique. So when we send the kit out, there are little tubes with media in them. That's basically a liquid that has nutrients for the tissue when it's collected, to keep it kind of refreshed as it takes its less than 24-hour journey to where it's going. And so there is a freezer pack on the way out to keep that media cool that the tissue is going to be put in. But we know that hospitals don't necessarily have freezer packs there on hand, and we don't want to require extra work for them. So at the top of the box is what's called a nanocool. It is a self-cooling mechanism that basically will cool to 4C. And for those that don't know, that's basically refrigerated temperature. And all the person putting the tissue in the kit has to do is literally push a button, and that automatically keeps the kit at that refrigerated temperature for the tissue journey to the biobank or to the research lab. And we overnight those tissues because we want them in the hands of researchers, or them to be processed into the biobank as soon as possible, to keep them as viable as possible for lots of other downstream uses for that tissue.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Another question I have, I guess this is partly from my work as a physician, is sometimes we do a biopsy and maybe I haven't even sent the person to a big cancer research center, and we get a tissue sample back, or they did a surgery at the local facility, and we discover, hey, this was a rare cancer. We didn't know till we did the biopsy, and now we have that tissue in the facility, or we forwarded it on to a cancer center, But so is there a way for people who have already had their biopsies performed and everything's in block, or it's in formal and formaldehyde? Is there a way for that type of tissue to get to the biobank?
Absolutely. Last fall, we changed our protocol so we now can accept stored tissue. Historically, we really focused on the fresh living tissue because that's what's needed to make things like living models of cancer tissue that drugs and things can be tested against. But they've made so much progress now in the lab on the things that they can do that we're getting lots of requests for stored tissue as well. So if a patient has tissue somewhere stored, even if they don't know how it's been stored, they can consent on pattern. They'll mark the box that they're interested in giving stored tissue instead of having a procedure coming up. And then we'll reach out to whatever institution that tissue is stored at and work with the pathology or other group there to see if there's any excess tissue that they're comfortable releasing to us that might not be needed for the patient care in the future. We want to make sure there's always some tissue in case a patient would need it for something in the future. But so we'll work with the group there at individual hospitals to make sure that we do that on the patient's behalf. And then we'll always let the patient know if we were able to secure the tissue, whether it be fresh or stored tissue, so that they know what's happening with any samples that they may have granted us access to.
So the regulatory environment is complicated. in every institution. And so I imagine part of your work with Pattern is trying to go through some of those barriers because you're working with literally hundreds of institutions and they each have their policy and they each have a historical thing that they've done. And some of it's based on individual policy. Some of it might be based on state regulation and some of it might just be individual preference. How do you navigate through that? Because getting all these samples into a biobank, into a central repositories that can be accessed by researchers is really important. It's a big deal, but it's hard. There's lots of barriers that I think an individual institution would have a trouble overcoming or an individual person has trouble doing. So how have you approached that?
That is a great point, and exactly the reason why we were founded is Mark, our founder, realized that the way to navigate through all of these institutional and regulatory barriers that exist, and many of them exist for good reasons, but they are barriers that are preventing research from moving faster, is by going directly to the patient. So having the patient sign the consent online and us being able then to go to whatever institution it is and saying, the patient has asked us to collect this tissue on their behalf, allows us, we have about a 95% success rate in getting the tissue out when indeed there is tissue available. There are times when the institution will say no, but that has become less frequent over time. We've been doing this now for about 9 years in terms of collecting tissue. So we're pretty successful in getting it out when there is tissue available to share. And I guess one thing I would say that maybe even when I started in this role a number of years ago is I didn't realize how important, I knew patients should be at the center and I knew they were very important in the whole process, but I didn't realize that the whole crux of the research and where things can get stopped is patients have what researchers need. And in simple terms, that's the tissue that comes from a patient's body and data that's associated with how their body has reacted to drugs, when they were diagnosed, environmental factors, which all of that's contained either in their clinical history records or if they have sequencing done. People may have heard of genomic sequencing. All of that type of data also is very beneficial to researchers to find out why patient A is responding differently to the exact same drugs for the exact same disease than patient B is. So if you think about patients are the key that is needed for the researchers to unlock new discoveries to help find new ways to stop that cancer from continuing to grow in patients' bodies. So we're trying to intersect at the point where patients can help control the future therapeutic options for the disease by donating what they already have when they're willing.
I can imagine, like, especially rare cancers, like solitary fibrous tumor, for example, my understanding is there's 300 or fewer patients in the United States of America that are diagnosed with this disease per year. So it's a small group. And if we're scattered across 50 states and 20 or 30 big research centers that deal with a lot of cancer, but it's just really hard to get all that information. And so every institution doesn't necessarily have solitary fibrous tumor tissue samples in their biobank, but Pattern probably does. And like you said, you created a biobank specifically for solitary fibrous tumor, and this could extrapolate to other cancers. One of the questions that I have is, if I say I went to my cancer institution, they do research and development. Why should I, as a patient or a clinician, want to have all this information in a central repository versus just entrusting or just relying upon the team at my individual institution to do that research? Because I think there's a real powerful thing here that we've hinted around, but I want to hear your description of that.
Sure. We always want to support research wherever it's done. And we think it's incredible when institutions are doing research, particularly when they're doing research on rare cancers. The problem is a lot of institutions aren't doing research on rare cancers because even if they have a few samples, they may not have enough, and they have a real hard time accessing tissue from other institutions. Not to say that it can't be done, but in many cases, it's a very strenuous, long, drawn-out process. So the reason why we created our biobank, and our biobank is fairly new, we just opened it last year, was because continuously we kept hearing from researchers that even if they had some samples in their own labs, they needed access to more, and or ones that were in a lab at their institution weren't available to them. Every tissue is precious. It's just making sure it's getting into the right hands so the research can be done. So by putting the tissues in a biorepository such as the Pattern biorepository, we are basically, what we're saying is open source, in that we allow researchers to come to us regardless of where they're trying to do their research so that they can get access to those samples and breaking down those barriers. I don't know if I want to say it's a funny story or a sad story. We're literally working with an academic institution now where a researcher is trying to study a rare cancer. The pathology group at their institution is actually in the same building, but like on a different floor. They cannot access any of those tissues from surgeries that are done in their own hospital because of institutional barriers. So actually what we're working on is they're going to have patients that are being treated in their institution consent through Pattern, so this research lab can actually get access to those tissues. It sounds crazy, but this is a true story of what is going on today. You would think it would be easy for them to just walk upstairs and get access, but that's not the way it's set up in that particular academic institution. So they asked if we could help. That same lab also is going to start a section in our biorepository to try to get other groups to send tissues of that particular cancer into our biorepository so it can be accessible not just to them from the academic institution, from this researcher that wants to pay for it, but so other researchers will have access. So even researchers in academic institutions that are doing great research realize that there are still so many obstacles within their own and other areas that they are raising funds to put samples in our biobank just so that there's greater access to all. I know it sounds
When
kind of crazy.
you describe it like that, you think, yeah,
Yeah.
how are we ever going to win? But I do think that there's a place for what you just described, to have a biobank, a repository of information. And I like the word you said is open source. If I say, no matter where you're at in the United States, you can donate tissue. And I think what we shared before you hit record, you shared that you can only take samples from within the United States, but you can share those samples and that data with any institution pretty much anywhere in the world. Is that correct?
Correct. We just are limited right now because of regulatory reasons that we can only collect right now from anywhere in the US. And that includes Alaska, Hawaii, but we can't collect from other parts of the world, tissue or data right now.
Yeah. There's this wonderful opportunity to do this. I guess another question I had is, so are most of these collections through Pattern being initiated by the patient saying, hey, doctor, or hey, institution, I want my tissue or my information sent? Or can a clinician at an institution say, we recommend putting your information in a central repository biobank, and because sometimes patients haven't heard about it, or you feel like you got a ton of bricks dropped on your head because you heard the word cancer, so it's hard to think long-term. So how often are these samples being initiated by clinicians or institutions? How often does it happen by a patient?
Historically, it's primarily been through patients, although over the past 6 to 8 months, we've been working trying to let more clinicians know about our work. And we are more than happy to provide information that they can put in their waiting rooms or they can hand to a patient. It's just a simple card. We can even make it with their institutional logo if they want. They don't have to have that. We try to make it really easy where there's a QR code where a patient can just scan it and they can be taken directly to learn more about pattern.org and what the Rare Cancer Research Foundation is about. So we are starting to work more with institutions, with individual clinicians, as well as still working with various advocacy groups and individual patients through Facebook groups, et cetera. We're happy to get the word spread out about us in any way, any ideas that people have. We're more than open to talking with them on trying to let more cancer patients and clinicians know about the work we do. One thing also, I'm not sure if your listeners are aware that your typical rare cancer patient is misdiagnosed 3 times. So one of the values of when we're sending tissue out, we have the ability that's IRB approved, meaning we have approval to do this, that if during the research that's being done with the tissue and an incidental finding is found, let's say something is showing up in the lab with the tissue that doesn't seem to correspond with what's known about that particular rare cancer, we now have the ability, the researcher lets us know, and we can go back to that patient's clinician and say, hey, in the lab, this was what's found. You may want to take a look at this or do further investigation to see if really the patient has XYZ, or potentially there is a new treatment option because of what was found, et cetera. Again, that was changed in our protocol about a year ago so that we have that capability, just as one thing that may help clinicians as well as patients in the future.
The audience for this podcast mostly are physicians, and there's some patients who have solitary fibrous tumor. We're a small club, so some of my fellow solitary fibrous tumor patients listen along. But I think this conversation is relevant for both physicians and patients. Listen, to say this is an opportunity to get these tissue samples so they can be used in research, kind of overcome institutional barriers of just so we can share data. And you can make a tremendous difference when you have larger data sets. A lot of the studies for solitary fibrous tumor have the number of patients being studied is a number fewer than 20. Those studies of 10 or 15 or maybe 20 patients. And then there's some meta-analyses that will looking at a bunch of different studies, and you try to get a collective group. But an individual study where you ran something on a group, it's really hard to get significant numbers of people. So I can see tremendous power coming from an organization like Rare Cancer Research Foundation at pattern.org, so that you can actually do really useful studies and aggregate a lot of information. So I do think that's really an important step that you're describing.
Also, if you don't mind me telling a personal story in terms of the value of data, which those that have not really worked with data may not realize. So as I mentioned, my nephew started the foundation. He had ocular melanoma, which is a rare eye cancer. And unfortunately, in 2020, his became metastatic. But as he had different lesions, so his different tumors popped up in different parts of his body, he had them sent off to different companies for what is called genomic sequencing to see what was happening with the cancer. So what at a biological level was happening. And he had sent out over a period of 8 months, 3 different tumors and to different companies. And it went to a third company. And all of a sudden, when he got the report back, it said that he had what is called an inherited mutation in a gene called POT1. He'd never heard of POT1. Quite frankly, a lot of people have never heard of POT1. But it said that it was called a germline mutation, meaning he had inherited from one of his parents. But the other 2 reports didn't say anything about that. So he actually hired bioinformaticians to look in the data. And it turns out it was in the raw data with the other companies, but it wasn't something that currently many clinicians or researchers are looking at, this particular POT1 gene. As of 2021, only about 100 families in the world had been diagnosed with it. It turns out he had a mutation in the POT1 gene. I mentioned that my brother had glioblastoma multiforme. He also has that mutation, and turns out I do as well. So I have had 2 different cancers. I'm doing great. Life is good. But if someone hadn't looked into that data and realized there was something in there, so that was a new finding for our family. And it's now allowing my brother and I to be proactive in our care. And it was just because something was in all of that raw data files that just really hadn't been looked at or not much was known about. And we believe that not just POT1, but think of how many other potential things could be found if we continue to consolidate data so that the bioinformaticians that know how to look through there and others can find these new learnings that can help solve the complex workings that these diseases possess. And so that's just a personal example on how that's helped me and be proactive in my journey and my cancer care. And because this mutation is so rare, it's actually considered that I have rare cancers, and there are not a lot of us out there. But the more we group together like you and the SFT community have, the quicker we'll come to answers to provide a much brighter future and hope for these communities.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a powerful story. And I think it's reflective of the era that we are entering. I believe that we will get to a place where pretty much all of our cancer diagnoses are sequenced and that we know the genomic patterns. That's happening a lot already. And I think the more we assimilate this information, the more those patterns can show up. And then you can observe, okay, we see the pathology, we can tell you the what, but maybe now we can tell you the why. We've spent a lot of time on the what and we've tried to treat, but when you can get to the why of why these things are happening, and then there's a lot of strategies that can be made to fight cancer. And I, as a cancer patient, I remain very hopeful on those kind of things. And I think that pattern has a really important place in that to connect all these different pieces together so that researchers throughout the world who are diligently studying rare cancers can find answers that they would never be able to find without that repository of information. So I do think it's really important. And I think it's, again, important for both clinicians to know about that and for patients. They both have an important role in this.
Exactly.
One other question I had for you specifically about this is, so patients look at this and they say, well, it costs a lot of money to ship all this stuff to a central repository and have something that cools it to 4 degrees and keep it on storage potentially for years and have a bioinformaticist go over all the information. Who's paying for all this? Or how do I have to pay for it? Does my insurance cover it? How much is it going to cost me? And an institution might have similar questions. How do you address that as far as the financial coverage component of that?
So as far as for the patient, there's no cost to their patient to donate their tissue through us. We will handle the cost. For an institution, there is really no cost for them if they want to help support getting the patient tissue into the kits. Just it will take a little bit of their time, not much, to put the tumor tissue and maybe collect an extra tube of blood into the kit. We are funded from a variety of different means. Philanthropy is one. Also, when we put the samples in the biobank, hopefully we don't have them there for years. Our goal is not to just create a big biobank where the tissues sit there for years and aren't used. We want to turn those tissues around as soon as we can. But a researcher that would be interested in accessing those tissues, they would buy like a vial of tissue or a sample from us that will help us recoup the cost to keep that biobank operational. And then researchers, if we send tissue directly from, let's say, a surgical patient directly to a lab, they will reimburse us for the cost of us getting that tissue to them. So we try to make it, we're trying to do this to help the common good, to help patient communities, and hopefully also it will help individual patients. Right now, if a patient is getting sequencing, we can help them get that or help doctors that may not know a lot about sequencing. We can help explain the program, the different companies that do it, provide the forms, help patients find out if it's going to be covered by their insurance, et cetera, as just a way to help educate the clinical as well as patient communities. But there's no cost really to an institution to work with us or for a patient to work with us. Just the researchers do pay a relatively small fee in order to access the tissues. The data for researchers that will be in the data commons, that would be free for researchers. Biotechs or pharma, there would be a charge for that to help,
Thank
again,
you.
cover our cost. We are a nonprofit.
No, that helps a lot to understand the funding process. So another question I had is, so patients who already know they have a rare tumor, a rare type of cancer, and they don't, like you said, you mentioned that they could donate their information through Pattern to look for that genomic sequencing or whatever information is there. And so just to make sure I understand that process, a person who already says, I already know I have this, I'm in the process of doing it, I have an oncologist that treats my rare cancer, they can go to pattern.org and it sounds like there's a process of just gathering that information. Is that the same process? They go through and sign the consents and then that data is kept collected in a central repository?
Yes. So what would happen if a patient doesn't have tissue or doesn't want to donate their tissue, but they do want to donate their medical records and or sequencing data, is they would go to pattern.org. When they fill out their information, there is a box that they can click for medical records only. And so they could click that and then we will send them, they can consent online. And then we will send them another form to sign because most institutions, they'll release the tissue with our general consent, but for their clinical history, their medical records, they'll require a different form. So we will send them through DocuSign, which is an electronic signature platform, a medical record release form. and then we will go to their hospital or hospitals where they've been treated, pull their medical records, extract the data, and put it in the data commons. Again, it'll be de-identified, so it won't be tied back to the so think when I say de-identified, it'll take off the patient's birth date and their name and information like that would identify the patient. And then that is put in what we call our data commons, where researchers can have access to look at that data for individual cancer types like SFT or across cancer types. And I know we've focused a lot on rare cancers because that's our primary focus, but even a patient with a more common cancer, if they want to participate, they can just let us know, and we're more than willing to accept their information as well.
Yeah. And as you said, for an institution doing research, the information there's not a charge for that, for they can use these data sets, but they'd have to pay a little bit to get the tissues transport to them if they're going to do that, because there is a cost to refrigerated shipping and all the storage costs associated with running a biobank.
Correct. There's you wouldn't think it was that difficult to get tissue out of an institution, but when you think we're working across hundreds of hospitals and the particular surgeon or pathologist may never have heard of us, so there are lots of calls back and forth, it's pretty time sensitive. We do ask if a patient can to consent at least several days, if not a week before their procedure, if they want to donate tissue. Although even if they consent just a day or two, we will do our best to jump through hoops to get the kit out. We just have to make sure the institution is willing to release that tissue to us, but we'll send a kit there in the hopes that they will, while we're working with them to reach the proper authority to say, yes, we can release the tissue to you.
I want to thank you for taking the time to share these details and answer all my questions, because it is really interesting for me as a patient and a doctor to see this really cool resource that's available for our patients. And I'm excited what it means for research going forward. So where would you direct people who want to learn more about this, or they want to contact you and try to understand more about this process?
So there are several places they can go. If they're interested in donating their tissue or data, it's simply pattern.org, pattern.org. If they want to learn more about our organization as a whole, it is rarecancer.org. If people have individual questions, they can send an email to me, Barbara@rarecancer.org. That's BARA at rarecancer.org. Or even they can go to our general info@rarecancer.org. Or they can go to our websites and see the links to all of our social media. Or there's also a link on rarecancer.org that they can send. It's the info email. So lots of different ways for people to reach out, whether they be patients that have questions, patient communities, or clinicians that might be interested in referring patients to us. Happy to talk to them at any point in time.
Thank you so much for sharing. We'll put that in the show notes. So if you're listening and you're intrigued by this and have more questions, get a hold of Barbara, ask me, and I'll forward it to Barbara. Let's just make sure we get this information out there. And again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. It was really a privilege to meet you and go through this. And I thank you so much for what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into the Doctors Making a Difference podcast. And thank you for what you do to help your patients and your community. Your work truly helps so many people. We produce this content to help you have the tools you need to stay in medicine and to highlight the amazing work being done by physicians around the world. Please note that while I am a physician, and many of the guests on this program are also physicians or other professionals, the discussions on this podcast do not represent my employer or any professional organizations to which I belong. This podcast is for your information and entertainment only, and should not be taken as professional advice. You should seek appropriate professional advice pertaining to your own situation. Please check out more of our content on our website, doctorsmakingadifference.com. Also, please follow, like, or subscribe on your podcast player or YouTube channel, and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps to spread the message. Finally, if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, or if you'd like to nominate someone else to be a guest, please visit the website or email admin@doctorsmakingadifference.com. See you next time.